And joining us now is Peter Stone, a Washington-based investigative journalist who has covered a wide array of lobbying, legal and campaign finance issues, working for the National Journal, McClatchy newspapers and the Legal Times, among other publications. He's the author of Heist, Superlobbyist Jack Abramoff, his Republican allies and the buying of Washington, and he currently writes for The Atlantic, The New Republic, New York Magazine, and The Guardian, where his latest article is Bannon and Allies bid to expand pro-Trump influence in local U.S. politics. Welcome to Background Briefing, Peter Stone.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Well, thanks for joining us. And it's sort of going a little bit under the radar, even though Bannon, of course, is in the news, having defied the House Select Committee. And then, of course, subsequently, he's been indicted by the Justice Department. But what he's doing, in spite of the legal jeopardy that he may face, and of course, he's defiant by nature, and I think he feeds off that defiance, is what he calls this precinct strategy that's underway in this multi-layered Republican assault on democracy. It seems to be incredibly effective, and I think it's caught the Democrats by surprise. I'm not sure they have anything even comparable. What has your reporting discovered for you, Peter, about the asymmetry between the activism on the Republican side and the Democratic side on this central key issue of voting rights?
Well, certainly, Bannon is just one part of a large attack on voting rights that Republicans have been waging, Trump allies have been waging for months now, after they were unsuccessful in overturning the election results from 2020. Bannon, just to be clear, has been indicted now on 2 counts of contempt of Congress. And he's pled not guilty and is due to go to trial probably in the summer now, is what's been reported. But his efforts to try to help boost Trump's position and to boost Republican fortunes in 2022 and 2024, as I was saying, was part of a larger effort. He has used his podcast, The War Room, which he calls an organizing tool, and has something as a extraordinary number of viewers and listeners, I should say. He's used the podcast for months now to promote what he calls a precinct strategy of finding local allies who would occupy key positions in elections and who would have potential to influence those elections. Some are candidates for local office, and he's had some of them on his radio show. This is, one facet, as I said, of a larger Republican campaign that Trump himself has waged by endorsing new candidates to oust foes who didn't go along with him in 2020, such as Brad Raffensperger, the Secretary of State in Georgia, who defied Trump's efforts when Trump leaned on him in a call on January 2nd, 2021, when Trump leaned on him to find enough votes to overturn Biden's win there. So Trump is supporting an alternative to Raffensperger in elections coming up this fall. And the Georgia legislature is one of over a dozen in the country that's passed new laws that tighten up voting requirements, tighten up absentee ballots, tighten up other voting requirements that are seen as discriminating heavily against minority and Democratic voters. That's a huge, part of this fight that's going on. It's also been waged in other ways too. But the Bannon piece of it is less covered. He's boasted about it, on his podcast, and it's gotten some coverage in some good publications, ProPublica. But I think it's something that the Democrats are nervous about. They don't have, as far as I know, they don't have anything quite like it at this stage. And certainly they're very concerned about, more broadly, the attack on voting rights, and have been working very hard to try to get a national bill through Congress that would restore some, or would guarantee voting rights. And that's been blocked primarily by, a filibuster threat in the Senate. and no Republican support, and no, so far they don't have enough votes to get it through the Senate. It's passed the House, a couple bills that would, protect voting rights.
And again, I'm speaking with Peter Stone, who's a Washington-based investigative journalist who has covered a wide array of lobbying, legal and campaign finance issues, working for the National Journal, McClatchy newspapers, and the Legal Times, among other publications. He's the author of Heist, Superlobbyist Jack Abramoff, His Republican Allies and the Buying of Washington, and he currently writes for The Atlantic, The New Republic, New York Magazine, and The Guardian, where his latest article is Bannon and Allies Bid to Expand Pro-Trump Influence in Local U.S. Politics. So if you go for the mechanics, the actual levers of power in the literal sense, and you've got people that normally you had neutral poll workers that were dedicated to democracy itself, and if you've got people that are dedicated to undoing democracy and supporting autocracy, it's a pretty frightening prospect. And your article at The Guardian, Peter Stone, Bannon and Allies Bid to Expand Pro-Trump Influence in Local U.S. Politics. The Allies have got deep pockets, have they not? The guy from the furniture company Overstock, Patrick Byrne?
Well, Patrick Byrne is working on other parts of this. He has helped fund rallies and a tour that's been going on in 2021 and is continuing this year, called Reawaken America, which his Associate General Flynn, who is spokesman for a Byrne group called the America Project, Flynn has been the star at these rallies, and they mix disinformation, debunk charges about the 2020 elections, and what they still believe was massive fraud that enabled Biden to win. That's been widely discredited. Flynn has been a star at these rallies, and as I said, they mix false information about the 2020 election with a number of other conservative issues and some evangelical themes. The rallies have included doctors who are considered less than authoritative, who've been pushing, phony cures for COVID, opposing mask mandates, raising questions about effectiveness of vaccines. These include a woman named Dr. Simone Gold, who is in Beverly Hills. You've probably heard of her. She's been a leader of a group of very conservative doctors who have been active on this front in the last year, and has had her own little PR tour going on over part of 2021. Yes, they have deep pockets, and the Flynn effort that Byrne has backed is another facet of this. Flynn has also recently come out for some candidates himself in different states who are Trump loyalists. So they're again, it's a multi-pronged attack on what were considered in the past mostly, fair elections with a minimum of fraud.
Well, hasn't Flynn's brother, Joe Flynn, taken over the direction of the America Project?
Well, he's taken a prominent role there. Yeah, he's taken over a role as president. It's hard to tell yet how. It's a fancy title. It probably will give him will give him certainly significant authority. Who calls the shots there is still a little bit unclear. Byrne was the founder of the group, has been involved with it from the get-go in early 2021. General Flynn, has been special advisor and spokesman for the group. And he has another group, which I mentioned in my story, called America's Future, which he became chairman of in May. They too have a project underway that involves an alliance of county groups and other conservative groups. And they've been focused a lot on, finding allies, new candidates to win office on the county level. which has some definite echoes of Bannon's precinct strategy. Again, focusing on issues which seem to be resonating with the Trump base. Again, issues like opposition to mask mandates and vaccine skepticism, and continuing to demand audits on the 2020 election, which has been, I should say, part of the Patrick Byrne agenda too at the America Project.
So nothing they're doing is based on facts, reality, science, right? It's just pure political activism in a very negative way. But one of the things that they're very good at, the Republicans, and I don't think the Democrats, even though the young vote is theirs for the picking, it seems like the Republicans are being very effective in another one of these groups called Turning Point USA, which is focused on recruiting young people.
Right, and it's broadened its agenda considerably. I mean, that's how it started about a decade ago, and it's become much larger, much more influential. It's had major fundraisers the last 3 years. Each December of the last 3 years, it's had events down at Mar-a-Lago, at the Trump Mar-a-Lago residence resort. Residence now has been, his club, and they have built, an alliance. They seem to have a lot of support from Donald Trump Jr. They're very active on college campuses, but they have expanded into, Charlie Kirk, who's the head of it, has become a talk radio figure, and they have ties to some of the Christian evangelical right as well. They have allied themselves with one of the Flynn groups on this county project. So they're a big presence too in this sort of multi-pronged effort that we're talking about.
And how are they doing in terms of getting around being deplatformed? I take it they've moved a lot to Telegram and something else called Getter.
Well, Bannon has because he was deplatformed. Yes, Bannon has moved to Telegram and some other alternative online sites, and has a large following according to people who track data on this. I interviewed a expert from Elon University named Megan Squire, who found a lot of information that they've been fairly successful in building, a following on some of the alternative online sites, Telegram being one.
Well, you almost wish that the Democrats had a Bannon, but I guess they're just too nice. Is that their problem? I mean, I'm given what they're doing in order to rig the vote for the Republicans at the precinct level and putting in people that literally are not in the machinery of democracy, that are opposed to democracy and want to enable autocracy. That in itself is extraordinary, but it reminds me of what Stalin once said: it doesn't matter who votes, it matters who counts the vote.
Right. Well, I think Bannon has certainly some autocratic tendencies. Flynn has voiced autocratic sentiments, but it's, one thing to hear their plans. Cautionary note is important. It's one thing to hear their plans, and Bannon likes to boast a lot. Flynn, too, has talked loosely at different times in the last year about topics that have drawn heavy criticism. It's one thing to, launch these efforts. How successful that will be is another, question mark. It's still. And obviously there's been some attention paid to them, and they may gain scrutiny from various, investigators. It's unclear how much scrutiny they will get, because obviously the House committee looking January 6th has focused on other things that Bannon has done in the run-up to, the 2020 or right after the 2020 election to help Trump. Likewise, they focused on what Flynn was doing after the 2020 election to help Trump. But they're certainly on the radar screen of the House Select Committee, and they may be on other radar screens too going forward.
Yeah, but what's being done to stop the takeover of elections at the state and county level, at the precinct level?
Well, as far as I know, these are, fairly nascent efforts. They're fledgling efforts. That's what I was trying to say a while ago. I mean, they've been talking a lot about it. They've been trying to build alliances. They've got candidates they're grooming to run for office. Part of this has to do with getting candidates elected, right? It's not just installing them. They're doing a lot of organizing. Some of it may pay dividends, may pay, considerable dividends in 2022, but it also, the proof will be in the pudding. I'm not trying to minimize it, but I'm just saying there's a lot of bravado, certainly from Bannon. He talks big, and how successful he will be is still an open question. They have money, both, particularly the Flynn operation has wooed some very wealthy backers who are committed to spreading a lot of disinformation about what happened in 2020. And that's very worrisome. Both of them are doing that. That's very clearly worrisome. And all the disinformation about the election results has been instrumental in prompting state legislatures to pass new laws, Republican legislatures, primarily dominated legislatures, to pass new laws that will make voting harder. That we already know has had results, right? Mm-hmm. Something like 19 state legislatures, according to the Brennan Center, have passed laws this year. That part they have achieved results on. The part about, how far they've gotten in terms of, quote, the precinct strategy is still, a work in progress is what I'm trying to get at. And
well, in the last minute then, Peter, let me just ask you in the last minute here that what you're indicating, though, is, again, another asymmetry between the Republicans and the Democrats. Republican donors, big money, deep pockets guys, just give money for strategy. They understand the importance of strategy. The Democratic donors, on the other hand, are interested in candidates and issues. And look what they did, for example, running Amy McGrath against McConnell. They raised $90 million on a completely dead-on-arrival race. So there seems to be an asymmetry there, that the Democratic donors want flashy headline grabbers, whereas the Republican donors invest in strategy.
Well, there's some examples on the Democratic side, I think, that would probably indicate they're not quite as asleep as, you're suggesting. I think the Republicans have been on a tear since the 2020 defeat of Trump to try to change the playing field. And that certainly has had some results already in terms of state legislatures that have enacted all these laws, and candidates who Trump and allies are putting a lot of money behind in key states, Georgia, Arizona, Michigan, Pennsylvania, where there are candidates running for governors, Senate seats, Secretary of State seats, who are still out there saying, the election was a fraud. So there's a lot of money going into that too. I think Democrats are aware of that element as well as the state legislatures, and are trying very hard to figure out a strategy to get a bill through Congress, which would be extraordinarily helpful and important in countering the new rash of state laws that are making voting harder. So there are efforts underway, and there's some money going into those as well. I'm sure there are lobbying campaigns, there are ad campaigns to turn up the heat on Manchin, to support, a carve out of some sort on the filibuster. Different strategies are playing out there. Right now, it's looking kind of gloomy, but hopefully, things may change.
Well, Peter Stone, I thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. And again, I've been speaking with Peter Stone, who's a Washington-based investigative journalist who has covered a wide array of lobbying, legal and campaign finance issues, working for the National Journal, McClatchy newspapers, the Legal Times and other publications. He's the author of Heist, Superlobbyist Jack Abramoff, his Republican allies in the buying of Washington, and he currently writes for The Atlantic, The New Republic, New York Magazine and The Guardian, where his latest article is Bannon and Allies bid to expand pro-Trump influence in local U.S. politics. We're going to take a brief station break. We're back with a Canadian scholar at the forefront of analysing violent conflict who says that by 2025, American democracy could collapse, causing extreme domestic political instability, including widespread civil violence, and by 2030, if not sooner, the country could be governed by a right